Fabulous. Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction and backstory, Shanna and Ian. It's absolutely awesome to be here. I just want to say a huge congratulations to all of you for the amazing effort you've put into organising today. And I'm so excited to hear all of the other speakers as well. So, as you already know, my name is Jasmine, and I'm here today to speak about applying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander philosophies to cybersecurity strategies. Now, before I deep dive into this complex topic, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we are joining ComfyCon today, and I would like to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to thank the First Nations men and women who I've collaborated with while creating this speech, for their support has been invaluable. So before I go any further into my research, I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about my experience. So I recently completed a Bachelor of International Relations, majoring in Languages and Culture at Bond University. And I'm now studying a Master of National Security Policy Studies at the ANU with a focus on cyber warfare. I'll hopefully be doing my master's thesis on applying First Nations philosophy to national security strategies. In 2021, I was selected for an awesome initiative called Project Friedman, which is sponsored by ASD and Women Speak Cyber. Now, as a part of Project Friedman, I received professional mentoring from First Nations entrepreneurs to help in the creation of today's speech. So I was encouraged to think about my speech in accordance with where I am now in my life and my knowledge as a proud Torres Strait Islander woman. After this mentoring and interviewing a range of people, from First Nations through to government personnel, we arrived at the conclusion that cybersecurity strategies may be strengthened by applying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge. So now that I've gone through a little bit of that backstory, I'd like to draw your attention to the overall research focus that you can see on the screen. So the research focus for today is that cybersecurity strategies can be improved upon by utilising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander philosophies. So the reason I use the word philosophies here is because each tribe and clan has a unique set of knowledge and cultural practices. But for the purpose of today, I will refer to this as philosophy because there are a core set of strengths that are evident in all First Nations groups. So to demonstrate the research focus, I'll first start by explaining what do I mean by First Nations philosophy and cybersecurity in the context of this speech. I'll then discuss three elements or areas of Indigenous philosophy and how they can map to cybersecurity. These three elements include adaptability, ethical and moral wisdom, and autonomous regard. I'll then expand on this link and discuss my viewpoints of why I think it would be advantageous to consider this knowledge in cybersecurity strategies. And then to end today's topic, I want to provide some practical points for everyone online to take away. So let's get into it. What exactly do I mean by First Nations philosophy? Well, as you can see on my handy diagram, cultural practices and law, LORE, is at the heart of Indigenous beliefs. So systems, rules, and obligations are ways of living that provide guidance to First Nations peoples. So you might be wondering, what do I mean by law, LORE, versus law, LAW? Well, law, LORE, is a cultural law that has been passed down from generation to generation for the past 65,000 years. This outlines our relationship to place and all things in our place. It also shows that First Nations people have a responsibility to look after the world that we live in. So again, that's rules, systems, and obligations. So those elements that I mentioned before, ethics, autonomous regard, and adaptability, all fit under the rules, obligations, and systems. So it's a little bit like an ecosystem. All of these concepts interrelate and they interconnect in some way, shape, or form. So when we look at cybersecurity, I also like to think of it as an ecosystem. Cyber policy, trade policy, disaster and emergency response, social well-being, and healthcare all interrelate and interconnect in some way, shape, or form. So the things that we do in cybersecurity have direct implications for the other policy areas you see on the screen. And in turn, this impacts our diplomatic relations with countries. So much like an ecosystem, we need everything to function as best as possible, or else our diplomatic standing and our best interests can be placed at risk. I'm going to switch pace here for a second, and I want to talk about something called the digital divide. So it might seem like it goes against the purpose of this speech, but I think it's really important that we address some of the barriers that are currently in place so that we can have a chance of overcoming it as an industry. So the digital divide stems from the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which tracks and reports on digital inclusion across the country in regards to all citizens, including First Nations, people with disabilities, and people who live below the poverty line. Now, this report demonstrated some concerning statistics regarding the access, affordability, and availability of technology for First Nations people, and that First Nations people face significant risks and disadvantages online. And for starters, 1 in 4 Indigenous homes don't have internet. Now, this is a barrier to education, healthcare, and a range of other important things that we all need in this day and age. But what this report also highlights is that Indigenous Australians use social media in unique ways, such as connecting between generations, connecting with culture, and connecting with other Indigenous peoples globally. Statistically, the report found that Indigenous people use social media at a higher rate than non-Indigenous people and adapted quicker than any other user group in the country. Now, to me, this shows an ability to adapt and a willingness to learn, which can be harnessed in our cybersecurity strategies. So speaking of adaptability, let's get into our first element. What do I mean by adaptability in First Nations philosophy? Well, non-linear thinking is used to get to the root cause of the issue. And there's an inherent adaptability and ingenuity that stems from the spiritual and physical realms that Indigenous Australians live with. It also means harnessing indirect management strategies and strong analysis capabilities to help create holistic outcomes. Now, the outcome here is, to be quite frank, holistic. So what do I mean by adaptability in cybersecurity then? Well, cyber threats need non-linear thinking. They are always evolving, meaning we have simply no other choice but to adapt. And we have to think critically and have a solutions-based approach to address new capability gaps. And the outcome here is to have a resilient strategy. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is what our first response to threats looked like, with 7 core phases in the cyber kill chain. And this is the MITRE attack framework, which demonstrates how our industry has adapted to the changing threat landscape. Now, I'm not saying one has replaced the other by any means, but it is an example of how we have had to adapt. So I'm going to switch pace. It's a bit early on a Sunday, but we'll test the audience. Who here had a cup of coffee today? I'm sure a lot of you did. I know Shanna did. So what was needed to make that cup of coffee? Coffee beans, milk, a cup, sugar, water. What would happen if we took away the coffee beans? Well, you don't have a cup of coffee. And what would happen if you took away the cup? Well, again, you still don't have a cup of coffee. And if you took away the water, you still don't have a cup of coffee. Why? Because in this example, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I'll say that again. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we talk about applying philosophy to strategy, who better to reference than one of the most respected philosophers of all time, Aristotle. So let's pretend that cup of coffee that I mentioned before is now a cyber security strategy. We must include all parts in a national cyber security strategy that is robust, executable, outcomes focused, and defendable. And I think that we can all agree that as an industry, the threats that we face are complex and constantly evolving. So how can we use First Nations philosophy to benefit us as an industry when we look at adaptability? Well, if we apply Aristotle's statement, then we can argue it would be advantageous for the combination of different worldviews to be taken into consideration when we strategize, so that we can have a nuance in how we think as an industry. And I think it's fair to say that we as an industry, we understand that some individuals on the neurodiverse spectrum are better than others at solving complex coding problems, finding vulnerability problems embedded in code much more efficiently than those who are not on the spectrum. Now, certifications and skills in this example are not relevant. We are harnessing a different thought process, which is amazing. And so if we can accept that, then let's introduce cultural knowledge to the equation. A culture of 65,000 years who understands space and how everything interconnects and interrelates. There's a quote by an international relations expert, and he focuses on Australia's security environment. And he just published a book, and this quote stuck with me. Australia uses conventional thinking to solve non-conventional problems. As an industry, we do not want to be complacent. We need to adapt, and we need to come together as a team and support one another, even in the face of adversity. Again, this is all part of a robust, defendable, adaptable cybersecurity strategy that utilises something First Nations people call the village mentality. Now, this concept of the village mentality brings me on to my next point, autonomous regard. So when we talk about First Nations philosophy, we are talking about the oldest living continuous culture in the world. And there's been a socio-political order in place for the past 65,000 years. Throughout that time, the value of relationships have been paramount. We respect the sovereignty and the rights of others, and we treat all with respect. We manage the diversity between cultures and any conflicts and tensions that have previously occurred. We respect one another because that is the village mentality. We all have a role to play in this world, and we respect that. We come together as a whole. And so when we fish in the Torres Strait, you fish knowing that either you all eat or none of you eat, including yourself, if you don't catch enough. That's what I mean by autonomous regard. So if we take the concept of autonomous regard and apply that to cybersecurity, then it suggests that Australia's digital autonomy has responsibility over our regional partnerships. And so we have to consider our role as an industry in the bigger picture of that ecosystem. And we have to manage our relations with governments across the world to ensure that those policy areas I mentioned earlier work at optimal efficiency. And there's an inherent entanglement, for good or for bad, between cyber and non-cyber strategies, which causes complexities that we all have to deal with. But what's the link here? Well, as people in the cyber industry, we need to consider the interests of international partners and act with dignity and respect. Let's harness the knowledge of the people who have been doing it for the past 65,000 years. Now, this could assist in managing conflicts that arise between our regional partners. It can prevent overcomplication and international tensions. And there is actually a need for this. The Whitlam Institute found that Pacific Islanders feel left out of Australia's reconciliation movement. And what people may not know is that First Nations Australians and Pacific Islanders share a very similar history from colonisation through to traditional ways of living and cultural values, especially with how we live in the Torres Strait and our value of that village mentality. So the Whitlam Institute found that Pacific Islanders are saddened by the absence of First Nations Australians when we engage with one another. The study also found that Australia has persistently failed to address barriers to reconciliation with its own people, and that has stopped the ability for a strong and respectful relationship with people in the Pacific Islands. So if we were to conduct a cyber engagement, for example, in this case, it would be imperative that we include and harness the knowledge of Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal Australians, because the perspective that First Nations people would bring can show increased respect and a strong value of the relationship, benefiting that ecosystem I mentioned earlier. So all of this links with ethics and morals and acting ethically and morally. So in First Nations philosophy, when we talk about ethical and moral wisdom, it means that the individual holds an ability to predict the outcome of a situation before it occurs. So there is a focus on the need for collaboration between communities to ensure that you abide by cultural morals and ethics passed down from generation to generation. And there are mutual obligations to all in the village. Now that builds respect, honesty, and trust. In cybersecurity, I think it's fair to say that we as an industry, we deal with some pretty blurred ethical lines. And you might have seen that Australia recently made a promise to make the internet a more democratic space. A report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute prior to Australia's promise stated, quote, "There is too much at risk to allow cyberspace to become a lawless world, and we need to continue to work together to identify the rules of the road in how international law applies to state behaviour in cyberspace, just as it does to activities in other domains." Now let's remove all the jargon from that. That is ethical and moral wisdom. Cyber and cybersecurity employees need to work together as a team and think smarter, not harder, to enable good management in the face of crisis. So if we heed ethical and moral wisdom, then as an industry, we have a better chance of acting with integrity, which in turn helps us with building relationships. Now, you may still be thinking, what's the actual link here? Well, it creates a nuance in analysis to define cyber threats, and it challenges traditional concepts that have arguably dominated cybersecurity for far too long. So if you apply ethical and moral wisdom of First Nations people, then you can strengthen Australia's regional partnerships. It also enables consistent reflection from differing cultural perspectives so that we can better handle the threats that are coming our way. I think it's fair to say that, again, we as an industry, we are a relatively new space and we are still finding our way. And that's totally okay. But to help us on that journey, I strongly believe that we can harness the ethical and moral wisdom of First Nations Australians. Now, to help us understand our position as an industry in the world and what I've previously referred to as an ecosystem. So what do we call all of this? Well, I call it situational awareness. Situational awareness is simply being aware about what is happening around us and being prepared. So situational awareness is a choice. We have to make the choice as professionals in this industry on whether we are aware of what is happening around us or not. So if you use situational awareness right, then you can predict the consequences of a situation before it even happens. Now, I'm not saying situational awareness is going to prevent a situation from happening, but it can give us as an industry a sense of control to overcome the setbacks that we face and quickly move forward. So utilising situational awareness means that we can adapt, take into consideration all factors of a threat, and have a robust cybersecurity strategy. Now, all of this may seem out of the left field, but let me reassure you that there is precedent for the use of cultural wisdom when strategising. So the Australian Defence Force, ADF, has multiple regional force surveillance units that have been in operation for over the past 40 years. Now, Norforce is one of those units, and it's made up of 60% Indigenous Australians who utilise their unique knowledge of the land to conduct collection of threats harming Australia's national interests. One quote from a former Norforce commander demonstrates the tangible benefits of including First Nations philosophy in Australian security. He states, "For the things we were doing in that environment, it isn't just the innate skills or particularly developed skills in any function of Norforce. It was an understanding of the country around them and the people who lived in that country and the patterns of life that happened in that part of the world. Indigenous peoples had the home ground advantage of understanding the territory, the people, the weather patterns, and how all that interacted was gold. And it was something that our adversary would never, ever have. And I really don't think that times have changed, especially when we strategize, and cybersecurity is no exception. Cyber threats impact everyone in this country, and people from all different backgrounds and skill sets deserve to have a seat at the table when we strategize. So, in terms of a more technical application of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge, I'm going to talk about this example from Dr. Abbas. So, in August of 2022, an Aboriginal language from the Northern Territory called Jingaloo made headlines in the cybersecurity industry. Why? Well, in what has been classed as a breakthrough for AI swarm systems, it has been theorized that the characteristics of the language actually allow it to be easily translated into AI commands. So Jingaloo has a total of 3 verbs: come, go, and do. So Dr. Abbas from the UNSW works with swarm systems, and he investigated systems that rely on gestures or direct commands. And he stated, quote, Jingaloo can translate straight into AI commands, a human language that humans can understand, an efficient language in its syntax that reduces computational cost, a language where we can change the context of use without changing its syntax to allow us to transfer the AI between different domains with ease. So since the discovery, the University of Canberra and the Defence Science Technology Group have created something called JSwarm, a language inspired by Jingaloo. Now, JSwarm can be applied to any situation where communications between humans and a large number of AI agents are required. So its application can be relevant in medicine, defence, national security, or agriculture, for example. So again, this is a perfect case study of the influence that cybersecurity has on the ecosystem and how Indigenous knowledge and practices can advance our industry. Now, with all of that being said, I think it's really important that I provide the listeners of today some practical points for consideration. When we talk about philosophy, it can get quite heavy, but I really want to highlight the importance of how we actually go about fostering talent and diversity. So remote work is crucial. It breaks down geographical barriers that are arguably still in place regardless of COVID-19, and it helps people find more opportunities, especially in tech. Identified role hiring can also help address and minimize barriers in place for the community and can increase the cultural capability of your organization. You can also, as a business, help fund certifications and help enable people to who might not necessarily have that qualification yet to gain it and then to have a rewarding career in tech. You could also investigate whether a reconciliation action plan is valuable for your organization, and it might not be. There might be a better metric that can be used to measure your progress in those diversity and inclusion areas. And as a part of all of that, I really want to highlight the importance of cultural competency training, especially within your organization, or you can undertake it individually. That is so important in ensuring a safe workplace. So my final point for consideration is that First Nations linguists could actually be hired for coding. So there are Aboriginal kids out there who know 8 languages. Now, their ability to learn, adapt, and retain so many different languages is an indication that they can learn coding quickly. And that would be an asset to our industry, even if they don't have the relevant qualification yet. And I truly believe that Jingaloo language and the creation of JSwarm is just the beginning. So we need to create more opportunities for First Nations men and women in this country. Now, when I talk about this topic, one of the questions that I'm most often asked about is, what resources do I have that people can go to learn more? So I've decided to collate some of my most trusted sources for all of you change makers online. First of all, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So there's a report called Building Genuine Trust, and that provides a framework and strategy for Indigenous STEM and cyber pathways. Now, if you're more interested in the technical applications of Aboriginal languages to AI, then there is Dr. Abbas's work, which can be found on the Frontiers in Physics website. It's called JSwarm, a Jingaloo-inspired human AI teaming language for context-aware swarm guidance. A few of the others, the statistic regarding access to the internet in Indigenous homes comes from World Vision and the Connecting on Country report, and a few other books that have a more so defence or international relations perspective would be No Enemies, No Friends by Alan Bem, Defending Country by Noah Reisman, and the First Knowledges book series as well. That one's amazing. So that's kind of it from me. As we come to the end of today's discussion, I hope that I've left you all with some key points for consideration. And if there's one thought that I'd like to leave you with, it's that the skills and qualifications can only take us so far as an industry. We need to invest in people of all different backgrounds and skill sets so that we can become stronger as an industry and gain new perspectives on emerging threats. To be bold, we need to think bold. Thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you all today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.